We had so much fun yesterday at the Pride Parade. Yeah. There were a lot of us there. Our mid-high and our youth groups, the First Unitarian Lavender family, and lots of other supportive adults turned out to march, many wearing rainbow tutus or rainbow hair. Go UUs. We had our 7 principal banners, and Herrera carried a sign that said, "Unitarians welcome all." Our ministerial resident, James Galasinski, was there, blowing bubbles, very important. And I followed right behind him, trying to pop them while doing hula hoop tricks. If you weren't there, you missed it. Sorry. You've got to work this hula hooping into a sermon, James said. I don't know about that. I know a bunch of UUs were there with other groups, too, like Veterans for Peace and Old Lesbians Organizing for Change. Yeah. Rock on, sisters. When people turn out for the Pride Parade, they really turn out, you know? Tutus, bikini tops, rainbow-painted men in tutus and bikini tops. There's definitely a culture of flamboyance, a fabulous one, if you ask me. And there are subtler fabulous things also, like lots of same-sex or otherwise queer couples walking down the street holding hands. That's still pretty rare on other days, a clue that we've still got a ways to go before public spaces truly feel safe and inclusive. And aside, I know that for many people who were born in the 1950s or before, the word queer can be troubling because it used to be a slur. But it has been re-embraced with pride now. It's the Q in LGBTQ, and it's an umbrella term that encompasses everyone whose sexuality or gender falls outside of the norm, quote unquote, the male, female, heterosexual, you are what you were assigned at birth norm. And since it's awkward to say LGBTQ over and over again, and since even LGB and T exclude some people, like intersex people, I'm going to go with queer. The flamboyance, the aura of celebration, and the safety to just be, to hold hands with one's significant other, whoever that person may be, is really beautiful in Pride Week. Recently, somebody asked Dan Savage, the advice columnist and queer activist, whether it's really appropriate for straight people to show up at Pride Parade. Aren't they kind of crashing the party, this person wondered. In his answer, Savage said, actually, straight people seeing Pride Parade is kind of the point. I thought that was an interesting answer. Was he saying that gay pride is really for straight people? I tell you what, to understand what he means, and also to understand how all that flamboyance came to be the culture of Pride Week and Pride Parades, it helps to remember how all of this got started in the first place. How did Pride Parades get started? Stonewall. Right. It all started at the Stonewall Inn, 57 Christopher Street in New York City on June 28, 1969. Well, maybe it's not quite true to say that it all started there, because after all, work for equality for gays and lesbians had already been going on for a little while. A few major milestones had happened. For example, in 1924, the Society for Human Rights was founded by Henry Gerber in Chicago. That was the first gay rights organization in the US, but it quickly closed under social and political pressure. In 1948, there was that Alfred Kinsey thing, a study on men and sexuality that reported that over 1/3 of men had enjoyed homosexual activities at least once. The study shocked the public, or at least 2/3 of it. and it shocked the psychological establishment. But the American Psychological Association would still go on to list homosexuality as a mental disorder in its first diagnostic and statistical manual. The listing would not cite any empirical or scientific evidence because no such evidence existed, but it would remain a diagnosable condition until the 1970s. In 1950, in Los Angeles, the first national gay rights organization was founded by Harry Hay. The Mattachine Society's goal was to eliminate discrimination against gays and cultivate an ethical homosexual culture. In 1955, the first lesbian rights organization was formed, Daughters of Bilitis. And on January 13th, 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court made its first ruling in favor of the gay community when it upheld the First Amendment rights of the LGBT magazine One, after the U.S. Postal Service and the FBI called it obscene. This summer, a little over half a century later, the court is expected to hand down another significant ruling upholding the right of same-sex couples to marry. And there had been a few marches and protests leading up to this point. But despite these early courageous voices speaking out, in 1969 things were still unbearable. Although it was the summer of love and a time of huge civil rights strides for blacks and Latinos, people who came out as gay were shunned by their families, their workplaces, and their communities, and they faced a high risk of being violently attacked. Gays were banned from working in the federal government or serving in the military because they were considered a security risk. Many gay or queer people fled to New York City, where there was still plenty of hostility, but at least they wouldn't have to face it alone. Most of those who still could would pass as straight during the workday. They had to if they wanted to keep their jobs. But even at night, the situation was far from ideal. While heterosexuals had a lot of sexual outlets like dance halls, bars, hotels, lovers' lanes, places where they could flirt and meet one another, there was no such thing for gays. There weren't many places that LGBTQ people could congregate, and whenever they did, they faced the risk of police raids. Being arrested could be devastating. It led to a public record that outed you to your family and community, and a criminal record that could prevent people from getting a job or going to school. In New York State, the Liquor Authority prohibited bars from serving queer people. The very existence of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgendered people was considered disorderly conduct. The mere existence was disorderly conduct. This prohibition, in turn, forced gay bars to go underground, becoming illegal saloons and speakeasies. In the summer of 1969, there'd been a major crackdown, and many popular spots had been closed. The Stonewall Inn was one of the few left. Like most of the others, it was owned and run by the mafia. Where regular bar owners saw a legal risk, organized crime families saw a business opportunity. Now, the Stonewall was not what you would call a high-end or even a pleasant place. It had 2 rooms, but only one door, the front door. The ventilation was terrible. The bar had no running water, and it was notorious for serving patrons in dirty glasses. In fact, Stonewall was blamed for a hepatitis outbreak that same year. The liquor was watered down, and it came out of suspicious-looking buckets. No one really knew what was in there. But the Stonewall was a place to get together when those were few and far between. And it was a place to be safe, or at least safer, from being attacked. Still, nothing was guaranteed. Although the mafia owner of Stonewall paid the local police precinct $1,200 a month to avoid a raid, everyone knew it could still happen. In the back room, which was the dance room, a white light bulb hung from the ceiling, and it was used to alert patrons to a police bust. When the bulb lit up, everybody would stop dancing and separate to avoid being charged with lewd conduct. On June 28th, that's just what happened. It was a hot, clear night with a full moon. The Stonewall had just been raided the Tuesday before, And raids usually happened in the early evening when they were going to happen, making it seem like a pretty safe bet to be there late that night. So the Stonewall was packed when the light bulb came on, and the police barged in and started with their usual routine. Round people up, check ID, check anatomy, make arrests, beat the place up a lot, and take all the cash. 13 people were arrested. The police were accustomed to doing this with little or no resistance from the arrestees and their friends. Everyone was too afraid. But this time, something different happened. As one woman was forced into the police wagon, she cried out to the crowd, "Why don't you guys do something?" And something clicked. They'd had enough. They started to taunt the police that passed between the bar and the paddy wagon. The crowd outside grew larger. They started throwing things. Fires were started. Word got out, and thousands of people showed up, and the police could not get the upper hand. Never before had the police experienced gay people as a threat. The stereotype was that they were weak. An article in the Atlantic magazine describes what happened over the next 6 days. It says, "The conflict played out as a very gay variant of a classic New York street rebellion. It would see fire hoses turned on people in the street, thrown barricades, gay cheerleaders chanting bawdy variants of New York City schoolgirl songs, Rockette-style kick lines in front of the police, the throwing of a firebomb into the bar, a police officer throwing his gun at the mob." I think you really look like you've given up if you just throw your gun, you know? He's like, "I'm out." Cries of "Occupy, take over," and "We're the Pink Panthers." Smashed windows, uprooted parking meters, frightened policemen, angry policemen, arrested mafia men, thrown cobblestones, thrown bottles, the singing of "We Shall Overcome" in high camp fashion, and a drag queen hitting a police officer on the head with her purse. There ends the Atlantic's report. But why had all of this happened at the Stonewall Inn and not one of the other countless places that had been raided and shut down in the weeks leading up to that? Well, there was something different about Stonewall's clientele. They tended to be the people who would not be welcome even in other gay bars. It was where the drags and the queens hung out. It was also where a lot of homeless youth ended up, boys in particular, who had arrived in New York City with no money or job, who had often left homes that had become unbearable because of their gayness or their family's reaction to it. One boy said his parents fought so much about which one of them made him gay that he left so that they could learn to live together again. Another said his father called him a homophobic slur, one I won't repeat, so many times that he began to think it was his name. Others had been kicked out onto the street and had nowhere else to go. And for $3, they could stay inside Stonewall all night, out of the elements, and mostly away from the threat of harm. They had nothing to lose when the cops broke in. Nothing to lose except for their one safe haven. So they fought for it. Dick Leitch, president of the New York Mattachine Society, was the first gay journalist to describe what had happened. He wrote, "Now we've walked out in the open, and we know how pleasant it is to have self-respect and be treated as citizens and human beings. We want to stay in the sunlight from now on," he said. "Efforts to force us back into the closet could be disastrous for all concerned." 1 year after Stonewall, there was a Christopher Street Liberation Day to mark the anniversary. Thousands of LGBT people celebrated by marching through downtown New York and into Central Park, what would later be known as the first Gay Pride Parade. Now gay pride parades happen every year, all over the country, and in other countries too. So that's how it all started. The journey continues. Youth being kicked out of their homes for being gay, that's still a problem. As many as 40% of homeless teenagers are queer. In comparison, only 7% of the general population are. Gay bashing and trans bashing, that's still a problem too. A transgendered person is killed in the US every 2 weeks and worldwide daily. Transgender people experience not only disproportionate levels of violence, but also unemployment, homelessness, and poverty. 41% have attempted suicide, not just thought about it, but attempted it. And this is compared to 1.6% of the general population. It turns out that today is Flag Day in our country, a day when people are supposed to fly the US flag and reflect on all that it means. It's a coincidence that I chose this day to preach a sermon called Freak Flags. I didn't realize it until yesterday. Darn it. But it's a nice coincidence. I called this sermon Freak Flags because I wanted to draw attention to the role of flamboyance and nonconformity in making our country better. Freak flag is not an insult. A freak flag is a characteristic, mannerism, or appearance which implies creative, adventurous, or unconventional thinking. It's the thing about you that gives you away. We all have freak flags because we're all a little bit weird. Some of us are just better at hiding it than others. To be flamboyant is to have a very noticeable quality that attracts a lot of attention. It comes from the French word to flame. Now, some of us have the ability to choose when to fly our freak flags. Some of us can choose when to be flamboyant, when to have a noticeable quality that attracts attention. And when we want to, we can hide it. Sometimes I've heard the question, why can't gays or lesbians or trans people just fit in? Why do they have to be so flamboyant? That's the question sometimes people ask. And I've also heard whites sometimes say that about blacks, as in, why does this person have to be so black, right? There's a lot to unpack in those kinds of questions, but it goes back to the fundamental discomfort of being confronted by something that is different from oneself, and the wish that everybody would just conform. Conform to whiteness, to straightness, to maleness. You know what? I even encountered this in my training as a minister, when I was taught, along with other female students, to try not to be too distracting from the pulpit. Don't wear bright patterns. Don't wear big earrings. Watch out for bright makeup. Whoops. Don't speak in too high of a voice. Don't let your knees show. Choose your shoes conservatively. You know what? When you add it all up, it sounds a lot like trying to be the typical straight white man. And I don't buy it. You want more diversity than that. And anyway, I love my zebra stripe pointy heels, and I am not taking these babies off. But I also know that I'm lucky to be able to fly my freak flag in my own way, right? To be a little different and to be accepted for that. Because sometimes a person cannot hide in a hostile climate. This was the case, especially in the 1960s and before, when the slightest hint of being gay or lesbian or trans would be picked up by the culture's conservative radar. It was the people who couldn't hide, the people who had nowhere safe to go, who stood up for themselves at Stonewall and set a cultural revolution in motion. It was a revolution for my generation and the ones after us to see through to its fruition as the first generations in which the majority want and vote for full equality. Without the extremes, without the voices of outliers and seemingly flamboyant nonconformists, there's no change in the status quo. In his answer to that question about whether straight should attend gay pride parades, Dan Savage talked about one other role that diversity, flamboyance, and nonconformity continue to play today. When you go to Pride, he says, you see dykes on bikes, you see the queer Christian organizations, you see the leather guys, you see the drag queens, you see the young men shaking it on flatbed trucks blasting dance music, you see the middle-aged, regular, roly-poly queers, he writes, and you see the gay dads and lesbian moms and their families. What you see is a million different ways to be queer. He continues, I think the message in Pride for straight people and why I think straight people should go is that there should be more than one way to be a straight person, too. Yeah. He goes on to say, there is a script written for straight people about how you're supposed to live your life and who you're supposed to be, and that script is confining and stultifying and restricting, and straight people need to break out of that. He concludes by saying, I think what a lot of straight people leave with is, wow, there's so many ways to be queer. Maybe I can conceive of perhaps a different way to be straight. There's more than one way to be whatever you are. Gay, straight, a woman, a man, a minister, a restaurant server, a scientist, fill in the blank. When we encounter radical diversity, we learn something about our own selves, about the assumptions and choices we've made, and we are liberated. And there's more than one way to be a church, too. On the sidelines at the parade yesterday, I saw somebody holding a sign that said, we're sorry for the way churches treat you. My church is sorry for the way churches treat people, too, I told the sign holder. I'm proud this Pride Week that our church is welcoming and affirming, that we are flamboyantly religiously liberal. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your journey, we are glad you're here. Happy Pride. And now we have the special pleasure of welcoming some